Say the name Dracula, and what do you picture? A caped vampire, right? The ultimate icon of horror. But what if I told you the legend was born from a real man? A 15th century prince whose actual life was so brutal it didn't need any supernatural stuff to be terrifying. So let's peel back the layers of myth and get to the shocking, true story of Vlad III, the man who'd become infamous as Vlad the Impaler.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to separate the fiction from the fact. On the one hand, you've got the myth, Bram Stoker's undead Count from Transylvania. But on the other, you have the real man, Prince Vlad III. He was a mortal warlord. He ruled a place called Wallachia, which is actually south of Transylvania, and his life was one long, brutal fight. He was very, very mortal. And honestly, his real story is way scarier than any vampire tale.
So that's the big question, isn't it? If he wasn't a vampire, then who was this guy really? Who was this man whose cruelty became so legendary it's now synonymous with evil itself? Well, to get that, we have to go right back to the beginning, to a childhood that was anything but normal.
You see, Vlad's story isn't just about a cruel ruler. It's a story of deep, profound trauma. His legendary brutality wasn't born in some creepy castle crypt. Nope, it was forged in the fire of 15th century politics, where his youth as a political hostage would shape the monster he was about to become.
And that famous name, Dracula? Well, where it comes from is pretty fascinating. Vlad's father was part of a group called the Order of the Dragon, a knightly order sworn to defend Christian Europe. This earned him the nickname Dracu, which means the dragon. So Vlad III was Dracula, literally the son of the dragon. But here's the kicker. Language changes, and in modern Romanian, Drac also means devil. Talk about a fitting, if totally accidental, twist of fate.
This timeline really lays out the foundation for all his trauma. In 1442, when Vlad was just a boy, he and his younger brother were shipped off as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan. Then, 5 years later, while he's still a captive, he gets the worst news imaginable. Back home, his own nobles, they were called boyars, overthrew and killed his father. And his older brother? They blinded him with red-hot stakes and then buried him alive. Just imagine, that forged his entire worldview, betrayal from the inside and a huge enemy on the outside.
And his years as a hostage, they were way more than just being locked up. Think of it as a dark education in the mechanics of terror. He didn't just put up with their cruelty, he studied it. He saw their punishments, he saw their favorite method of execution, impalement. He learned firsthand how you could weaponize fear, and boy would he perfect that brutal art.
And as historian Elizabeth Miller points out, this experience really defined him. His brother, Radu, kind of adapted to life with the Ottomans, but Vlad, his resentment just grew and grew. This captivity lit a fire in him, a lifelong, burning need for revenge. Pretty much every single thing he would do against the Ottomans was driven, at least in part, by this deep need to get even.
So after a brief, failed shot at the throne, Vlad finally becomes the ruler of Wallachia in 1456. He inherits this kingdom that's just swarming with treacherous nobles and constantly threatened by the Ottomans. His solution wasn't diplomacy. It was about consolidating power through absolute, raw, uncompromising fear.
Now, it's really important to get this. Vlad's atrocities, they were rarely random acts of insanity. Oh no, they were calculated political theater designed to send a crystal-clear message. When Ottoman diplomats refused to take off their turbans in his presence, he had them nailed to their heads to, strengthen their custom. To cleanse his cities, he threw a huge feast for the poor and sick, then barred the doors and burned the whole building to the ground. And to get back at the nobles who killed his family, he began a systematic, bloody purge.
And this brings us to his signature move, the one that gave him his infamous name, impalement. And this was a uniquely horrific way to die. See, the goal was never a quick death. A skilled executioner could guide a thick, sharpened pole through the body, deliberately missing the vital organs. This made sure the victim stayed alive, hanging there in unimaginable pain for hours, sometimes even days, exposed to the sun, the wind, and the birds.
This single number represents Vlad's magnum opus of terror, 20,000. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the guy who conquered Constantinople, marches his huge army into Wallachia, and he's not met by soldiers. He's met by a grotesque forest of rotting corpses. 20,000 captured Turks and their supporters, all impaled on stakes, stretching for miles outside Vlad's capital city.
The psychological impact was immediate and, well, profound. As a historian from the time wrote,
Even the battle-hardened Sultan was just stunned into silence. Mehmet realized he wasn't fighting a normal man. He was fighting someone who understood power on a primal, almost diabolical level.
You see, what Vlad did was turn his greatest weakness, his tiny army, into his greatest strength. He couldn't win a conventional war, so he waged a campaign of pure terror. That Forest of the Impaled, it wasn't just a mass execution, it was a billboard designed to shatter the will of his enemy. And it worked. The morale of the Ottoman army completely collapsed, and the great Sultan Mehmed was forced to turn back.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there? The very extremism that saved his kingdom would also seal his fate. His refusal to play nice made him a dangerous and unpredictable ally. His end wouldn't come from his sworn enemies, the Ottomans. It would come from the betrayal of his own side.
In a truly stunning turn of events, right after his huge victory against Mehmed, Vlad goes to Hungary to ask for help from his ally, King Matthias Corvinus. But instead of getting help, he gets arrested and thrown in prison. He'd stay there for over a decade. He was eventually let out, and he even managed to reclaim his throne one last time in 1476. But his rule lasted less than 2 months before he was killed in battle.
So you're probably asking, why? Why would a Christian king imprison Europe's most famous Ottoman killer? Well, the answer is politics. King Corvinus had taken a bunch of money from the Pope to fund a crusade he had no intention of actually fighting. So, to justify imprisoning the very guy he was supposed to be helping, Corvinus cooked up some forged letters that made it look like Vlad was secretly pledging allegiance to the Sultan. It was pure propaganda.
So in late 1476, Vlad was ambushed and killed. And in a final, horribly fitting act, his enemies cut off his head. They preserved it in honey, sent it to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople, and stuck it on a stake for everyone to see. The son of the dragon met an end just as brutal as his life, and to this day, nobody knows for sure where he was buried.
So what do we make of this man? In death, his story didn't end. It splintered. He became a completely different figure to different people, all depending on where you stood in relation to his bloody, bloody reign. His legacy is this crazy mix of hero, villain, and of course, the accidental inspiration for a monster. And this table here lays it out perfectly. To his German enemies, who he routinely tortured, he was a straight-up psychopath, a monster. But in Slavic stories from the time, that same cruelty was seen as a kind of harsh but necessary justice, the only way to bring order to a lawless world. And then in his homeland, Romania, many people still see him as a national hero, the tough leader who cleaned out the corrupt elites and stood up to a superpower to keep his nation free.
So ultimately, you can kind of distill his whole identity down into these 5 distinct faces. He was the hostage, shaped by trauma. He was the tyrant, who used terror to keep order. He was the crusader, a brutal defender of his faith. He was the national hero, a symbol of strength. And finally, he became the myth, the accidental inspiration that would overshadow everything else. Each one is a vital piece of his very complicated story.
Which leaves us with one last big question. How in the world did this medieval warlord become the world's most famous vampire? The truth is, it was basically a complete fluke. The author, Bram Stoker, was researching his vampire novel and knew almost nothing about Vlad's actual life. He just stumbled across a name that sounded cool.
And this note, right here, from Stoker's own research, reveals the entire connection. He didn't read about the battles, he didn't read about the Forest of the Impaled. He just saw a little footnote that said, Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. That single, spooky association was all he needed for his villain. And just like that, Vlad the Impaler was unintentionally reborn as Count Dracula.
And so that's what we're left with. This big, lingering question. Was Vlad the Impaler just a monster, born out of monstrous times? Or was he a hero, a patriot, whose brutal actions were the only thing that could save his people in a savage world? Maybe the truth is that he was both, and that his heroism and his monstrosity were just 2 sides of the very same blood-soaked coin.